Hello again, friends, and welcome back to the Soul Unleashed podcast. I'm your host, Mike Nicholas, and I'm basically a left-brainer struggling with spiritual questions, and I share that exploration and adventure with you. Thank you. Here we go. So this past Sunday, I attended Mass with my wife. It was a remote thing that we do. She's still hospitalized, and so we use an iPad to listen to a service. Anyway, the reading that took place, it was the first reading, I think, was one that really got me thinking. And the current metamorphosis, I guess, that I'm going through in terms of a spiritual awakening is I question all these things that I hear. I mean, years ago, I would listen to Mass, listen to the readings, they just kind of go over my head or whatever. This reading is from Numbers, the book of Numbers, and it's chapter 21. And some of you, I'm sure, are familiar with it, but for those of you that are not, it's about a snake in the desert. So the Israelites, they escaped from Egypt. They escaped from Pharaoh. They're wandering through the desert, and they constantly keep going through these cycles where they're okay with God, then they're upset with God, and He punishes them. They're okay with God, they're upset with God, then He punishes them. Then they go through the cycle where they repent, and He lets them keep going. Anyway, what God tends to do throughout the book of Numbers is He kills many of them. And so I'm familiar with that in Numbers. It's kind of some way, but let me read you this paragraph about the bronze snake. They pick up the Israelites. They just destroyed the Canaanites. And the Lord constantly does this also in the book of Numbers. He tells them to go out and destroy some people, and they do. As long as He's with them and blessing them, they kill everybody to the last man. They take all the women prisoners, etc. Some really interesting stories around that. But in this case, I'll pick it up on verse 4. They traveled from Mount Hor along the route to the Red Sea to go around Edom, but the people grew impatient on the way. They spoke against God and against Moses and said, "Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? There is no bread, there is no water, and we detest this miserable food." Then the Lord sent venomous snakes among them. They bit the people, and many Israelites died. The people came to Moses and said, "We sinned when we spoke against the Lord and against you. Pray that the Lord will take the snakes away from us." So Moses prayed for the people. The Lord said to Moses, "Make a snake and put it up on a pole. Anyone who is bitten can look at it and live." So Moses made a bronze snake and put it up on a pole. Then, when anyone was bitten by a snake and looked at the bronze snake, they lived. So that's the story of the bronze snake. And so I heard that and I thought, okay, so God killed a bunch of them with these snakes. In other versions of the Bible, they're described as fiery snakes. And that's interpreted as the bites either cause significant pain or swelling, or there's also a bunch of other interpretations that they were bit by these, quote, fiery snakes, and it caused great thirst because they were suffering from thirst. And so God had them bit by snakes, and they were complaining about thirst. Now they really suffered from it. Anyway, a lot of people died in this incident. So I went through the book of Numbers. I actually had ChatGPT help me out and count all of the people that God killed in the book of Numbers. So the book of Numbers has like 36 chapters. It's the story of them wandering around the desert. And when you add them all up, the maximum total, the minimum total, I'd say minimum because there's a lot of other places where people die, like here with the snakes, it doesn't say how many people actually died, just says many died. But if you actually count up what's in the Bible as far as how many people died, the minimum total from the incidents that they do count in here is 38,950 men. I say men because men are the only people that are counted here in the Bible. When they take all these censuses of the different tribes, it's just men. So 38,950 men as a minimum died, not including this thing here with the snakes and a couple other incidents where God punishes them. So that struck me as really hard to understand. And I'm not, I'm just some schmo in 2025 looking at this, trying to figure it out. For hundreds and hundreds of years, thousands of years, people have interpreted these verses, and there's a lot of commentary out there, and I'll talk about that in a second. But that's what happened in this particular case, and all these people were killed in the book of Numbers, and all these people were killed by the snakes. So I thought, what do some famous theological people think about this? Theologians, right? And I went and looked at Saint Thomas Aquinas and Saint Augustine, And they do have commentaries about the Bible and about God's justice, which is what this is related to. And both theologians would probably interpret these deaths and numbers as just punishment. They make a point about God being perfectly merciful, but also perfectly just. And that's what he was doing with the Israelites. They were rebelling against divine authority, and so they received just punishment. Another thing, they would have referred to it as a pedagogical tool to teach the remaining Israelites that were left about obedience and the seriousness of sin. So every time that God did this to the Israelites, and it happens here, is he punishes them, a bunch of them die, and then they turn right around and they say, we sin, we're sorry. And Moses intercedes for them with God, and then God saves them. It's also a manifestation of the divine order rather than arbitrary cruelty. Now, it struck me as arbitrary cruelty, right, when I read this, and that God appears to be angry when he does this. But Aquinas and St. Augustine make the point that it's divine justice and it's manifestations of the divine order, and that God is not angry, he's just being perfectly just. And it also is interpreted as a prefiguration or a look forward to eternal judgment and what that might be. So that was a little bit scary, but that's the way those guys interpret it. And then I looked for some other interpretations that were perhaps a little bit more modern. And there was someone called Matthew Henry. Now, his commentary is well known among Protestants that study the Bible. He lived during the 1600s, and his commentary is one of the most widely read and respected devotional commentaries out there. And his work covers many books of the Bible, including Numbers. And there are other commentaries out there, John Wesley and Adam Clark and some others. But I just stuck with Henry here first, just to discuss what he said about it. So here's a couple commentaries by Matthew Henry about this specific story about the bronze snake. So he talks about being divine judgment, and he notes that God sent fiery serpents among them. He uses the term fiery, which bit or stung many of them to death. And he makes the point that the wilderness through which they had passed for all these years was always all along infested with those fiery serpents, but up until this point, God had wonderfully preserved his people from receiving hurts by them. And now that they've murmured and complained, it was all bets were off, and they were able to attack the Israelites. So Henry sees this as a divine justice moment. The serpents were always present, but God protected the Israelites up until the rebellion. Now, the nature of the punishment is also important to Henry. Again, he refers to fiery serpents, meaning primarily the effect of their stinging, inflaming them, putting them into high fever, creating an insatiable thirst, and inflicting them with that which they were complaining about. He almost calls it poetic justice. They had unjustly complained for want of water, and then God chastises them, sends them this thirst and these bites for which no water would help. And he also makes the point that the cure is miraculous and entirely supernatural. So Moses puts up this pole with this snake on it. I didn't really get this when I heard this read the first time, but the point that Henry makes, and I guess it's valid, is that God did not make the snakes go away. He just had Moses put the pole up, and so when people were stung by them, they could just look at the pole and look up, and the method of cure was miraculous and was simply looking up and above at this snake on this high pole caused them to be cured. But the stupid snakes are still there. So God didn't make them go away. People were still being stung, but they were able to be cured by looking up. The Bible doesn't say how long the snakes hung around or what they eventually did with them, but that's what they did. And just a couple final notes about what Henry said here. He talks about this being a lesson of faith, and he emphasized that the cure, being cured from these fiery bites, the cure required simple obedience. And so the serpent being raised up did not cure them. It only cured them if the Israelites that were afflicted looked upon the serpent and looked up to the serpent. So no matter what they did to the wound, even though the serpent was up in the air, it didn't make any difference. They had to look at the serpent as Moses instructed. So for those who looked up to this healing sign, even though from the outermost part of the camp, says Henry, though with weak and weeping eye, they were certainly healed, unquote. And anyway, that's his. He does mention the fact that the serpents were still around for a long time. That serpent, by the way, is kind of interesting. It stayed around and was saved by the Israelites for a long time. It eventually became an object of worship and became an idol that they worshipped it was eventually destroyed by King Hezekiah. I don't know how many years later, but much later, they were already in Jerusalem. So that serpent was somehow preserved from Moses, became an item of worship, and they called it Nehushtan, and it was destroyed. So Henry, in his commentary, treats that bronze serpent incident as both historically real, he considers it real, and profoundly symbolic, which emphasized both divine justice, mercy, and the necessity of faith-based obedience for salvation. So his is one of the most comprehensive traditional Christian interpretations of this challenging passage. All that, honestly, folks, was way above my head. When I heard this thing, I just thought there's no way this could be real. I can believe that serpents would attack people in the desert, kind of been there, done that. But, they would be dying from these things on purpose. And then Moses puts up this serpent on a pole, and all they had to do was look at it to be cured. I guess you could take that for being historically accurate. Many commentaries do not. They take it as being symbolic. And as many of you know, my intent with this podcast is not to attack religion or attack the Bible or, criticize Catholicism or whatever. I'm just fascinated sometimes by, hearing things now that I've heard my whole life, but never really paid enough attention to. And so when I heard the story, I went back and I read the entire book of Numbers, all 36 chapters, because I started reading it from the first chapter to understand what was going on. And then I got involved in the whole story. And so there's a lot of questions I have about what God did to the Israelites and how he punished them. People that disobeyed him just being swallowed up whole by the earth. Other people that disobeyed him, being stabbed by spears and just killed. Women taken prisoner. There was like 32,000 interesting passages in the Bible, I don't know where it was in Numbers, but something about the Israelites conquered this group of people. They took 16,000 women, 32,000 women as prisoners. There was more than that, but Moses told them to kill any women who had lain with a man. And so they killed them, and they wound up with 32,000 women that had not lain with a man. Moses also told them to kill all the children, by the way. So there were no children in this group. I can't wrap my head around all this, but and then they split it. They took 16,000 and gave them to the soldiers, and 16,000 went to the different tribes, and it says all but 32 who were given up to the Lord. I assume they were sacrificed because they talk about all the animals too. The animals were sacrificed to the Lord, and then 32 of the women were sacrificed to the Lord. So that doesn't compute so much for me as a 21st century person trying to understand this, nor is it necessary, right? Like I said, I'm just somebody trying to grapple with this, and then I can't understand it reading myself. That's why I go back and look at these commentaries by theologians and commentaries by men who have studied this their whole lives to see what they say. I would say the common theme from Aquinas through Augustine to Henry to John Wesley and Adam Clarke is all, it's God's perfect justice and God's perfect mercy on display. And it's a forerunner or a preview of what the final judgment is going to look like. I've done some commentaries about final judgment and my understanding about that and struggling with that, but that's a separate podcast. So that's it. I'm going to put the reference here in the show notes for you. Again, it's Numbers chapter 21, the bronze snake story, and welcome you to read that, ponder that yourself. Maybe look at the whole book of Numbers. And for those of you that are Bible scholars and have read the Bible many times, my guess is that you don't understand it any better than people that have read it the first time do, but maybe you've come to appreciate it as divine justice. Thanks again. Look forward to talking to you again in the future. My book is out, by the way, The Soul Unleashed, and you can find that on Amazon. I don't talk about this particular passage, but the book itself talks about how I went from being someone who was very, I guess, conservative and accepting all these things to now where I question a lot of these things because of some spiritual experiences I went through. Thank you. Talk to you again soon. Bye-bye.